Oh, the pleasure is all yours. I am Lady Vesper. Though in this kingdom of secrets, my real name is worth less than a title won in a game of cards. My craft? Revealing what everyone longs to hide. And what you, of course, would die to know. Born of scandal, shaped by the hypocrisy of the nobility, and sustained by truths no one dares to print, I became the most feared whisper in the gilded halls of high society. They call me a gossip. I prefer a chronicler of decay. And today, my curious little creature, it is time for a new scandal. Lady Mirabelle vanished on the night of the Duke of Belgrave's ball. They say she was kidnapped. But what if I told you she ran away with the groom's brother, taking a royal necklace and 3 letters that could destroy an entire bloodline? Pour yourself some tea, hold your fan tight, because this story begins now, and ends with blue blood on marble floors. The Georgian mansions of Mayfair stood like magnificent sentinels against the dawn sky, their limestone facades gleaming with the promise of another day, filled with carefully orchestrated social rituals. Within these palatial homes, the cream of London society prepared for another season of elaborate deceptions, where every smile concealed a secret, and every curtsy masked an ambition. Lady Cordelia Ashworth adjusted her morning dress of finest silk, as she descended the marble staircase of Ashworth House, one of the grandest residences on Berkeley Square. At 23, she possessed the kind of ethereal beauty that poets attempted to capture in verse, cascading auburn curls that caught the light like burnished copper, eyes the color of emeralds after rain, and a figure that made even the most conservative empire waist gowns appear scandalously elegant. Yet beneath her porcelain exterior lay a mind sharp enough to cut through the pretenses of high society, like a blade through silk. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting geometric patterns across the imported Italian marble floors as Cordelia made her way to the breakfast room. The house itself was a testament to centuries of Ashworth wealth. Walls adorned with portraits of stern-faced ancestors in elaborate golden frames, Persian carpets that had cost more than most families earned in a decade, and chandeliers imported from the finest crystal workshops of Venice that tinkled softly with each footstep. Her father, the Duke of Ashworth, sat behind the Morning Chronicle, his weathered hands gripping the newspaper with the same intensity he had once reserved for commanding his regiment during the Peninsula War. At 57, the Duke remained an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair that spoke of nobility rather than age, and eyes that had seen too much of war and politics to be easily impressed by drawing-room theatrics. "Good morning, Father," Cordelia said, settling gracefully into her chair as a footman in impeccable livery poured her tea from a silver service that had been in the family for 3 generations. The Duke lowered his newspaper slightly, revealing a frown that had deepened considerably since the previous evening. "Cordelia, we need to discuss something of utmost importance. Something that threatens not only our family, but the very fabric of respectable society." Before Cordelia could respond, her younger brother Edmund burst through the breakfast room doors with the kind of dramatic flair that only a 21-year-old could muster. Recently returned from Cambridge, Edmund possessed the golden good looks and reckless charm that made him the darling of every mother with an unmarried daughter in London. His blonde hair was perfectly disheveled in the fashionable style, his blue eyes sparkled with mischief, and his tall, athletic frame moved with the confidence of someone who had never encountered a social situation he could not charm his way through. "Father, you look as though you have seen a ghost," Edmund said, helping himself to a generous portion of eggs and kippers from the elaborate sideboard. Surely nothing could be so terrible on such a magnificent morning. The Duke's expression grew even more grave as he folded the newspaper and placed it beside his untouched breakfast. "My dear children, what I am about to tell you must never leave this room. Yesterday evening, Lord Pemberton received a letter that has shaken him to his very core. The contents of this letter revealed details about his eldest daughter's secret correspondence with that fortune-hunting Captain Morrison, details that no one outside the family could possibly have known." Cordelia felt her pulse quicken, though she maintained her composed exterior. "How curious, Father. How could someone have obtained such private information?" That is precisely the question that has every respectable family in London terrified, the Duke replied, his voice dropping to a whisper despite the fact that they were alone save for the footman, who stood as motionless as a statue near the sideboard. This morning, Lady Pemberton discovered that her daughter had indeed been conducting a clandestine correspondence with the captain, using their lady's maid as an intermediary. Every detail mentioned in the anonymous letter proved to be absolutely accurate. Edmund set down his fork, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by something approaching concern. Anonymous letter? What sort of person would engage in such scandalous behavior? The Duke reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a piece of paper that seemed to radiate menace despite its elegant appearance. The letter was written on expensive cream-colored paper with a watermark that suggested quality and refinement. The handwriting was undeniably feminine, flowing, elegant, educated, but there was something about the precise formation of each letter that suggested a mind of extraordinary calculation. The letter was signed simply as the Masked Observer, the Duke continued, unfolding the document with the care one might reserve for handling a venomous serpent. But what makes this particularly disturbing is not merely the accuracy of the information, but the tone in which it was delivered. This person writes not as a gossiping busybody, but as someone who possesses intimate knowledge of our most private affairs and takes pleasure in exposing them. Cordelia leaned forward slightly, her emerald eyes fixed on the letter with an intensity that surprised even herself. May I ask what specific information was revealed, Father? If we are to protect ourselves from such intrusions, surely we must understand the nature of the threat. The Duke hesitated for a moment before reading aloud in a voice that barely concealed his outrage. My dear Lord Pemberton, I write to inform you that your daughter Charlotte has been conducting a most inappropriate correspondence with Captain Morrison of the 4th Light Dragoons. Their letters are exchanged each Tuesday morning when she takes her constitutional in Hyde Park, using her lady's maid, Jenny Walsh, as intermediary. The captain has promised marriage, but I fear you should know that he has made similar promises to Miss Eleanor Fitzpatrick of Gloucestershire and Miss Arabella Henderson of Yorkshire. Your daughter deserves better than to become another casualty of this gentleman's financial desperation. I remain, as always, your devoted observer of truth. The breakfast room fell silent except for the gentle ticking of the ornate clock on the mantelpiece and the distant sounds of London awakening outside the tall windows. Edmund had gone completely pale, while Cordelia found herself studying the letter with the kind of fascination typically reserved for exotic specimens in a natural history museum. This person knows things that should be impossible to know, Edmund finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. The specific details about the day of the week, the location, even the name of the lady's maid. How could anyone have such comprehensive intelligence about private family matters? The Duke folded the letter carefully and returned it to his pocket. That is exactly what has Lord Pemberton so concerned, and why he came to me last evening. If this masked observer knows such intimate details about the Pemberton family, what might she know about ours? What secrets might we have that we believe are safely hidden from public scrutiny? Cordelia felt a strange chill run down her spine, though she could not quite identify its source. There was something about the precision of the letter, the almost surgical accuracy with which it exposed the Pemberton family's private shame, that spoke to a mind of extraordinary capability, and perhaps dangerous intent. Has Lord Pemberton reported this matter to the authorities? She asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. And risk having the contents of the letter become public knowledge? The Duke replied with a bitter laugh. My dear daughter, you must understand that this masked observer has chosen her weapon with diabolical cleverness. The very families she threatens are precisely those who cannot afford to have their secrets exposed through official channels. We are trapped between our desire for justice and our need for discretion. As if summoned by the gravity of their conversation, Henderson, the family's long-serving butler, appeared in the doorway with the kind of silent efficiency that marked the best of English domestic service. At 62, Henderson had served the Ashworth family for over 4 decades, and his weathered face had witnessed everything from births and deaths to scandals and triumphs without ever betraying the slightest hint of judgment or surprise. "Your Grace," Henderson said in his perfectly modulated voice, "I beg your pardon for the interruption, but a letter has arrived that requires your immediate attention." The Duke's face went ashen as Henderson approached with a silver salver bearing a single envelope. The paper was the same expensive cream color as the one he had just finished reading, and the elegant feminine handwriting was unmistakably familiar. With trembling hands, the Duke broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter. His eyes moved across the page with increasing horror, and by the time he reached the signature, his complexion had taken on a distinctly greenish hue. "What does it say, Father?" Cordelia asked, though part of her was not certain she wanted to know the answer. The Duke looked up at his children with an expression of absolute devastation. "It seems, my dear ones, that our family has attracted the attention of the masked observer, and what she knows about us could destroy not only our reputation, but our very future in London society." The breakfast room fell silent as the full implications of this revelation settled over the family, like a suffocating fog. Outside, the sounds of carriages and pedestrians continued their normal rhythm, but inside Ashworth House, the comfortable certainties of their aristocratic world had suddenly become as fragile as morning mist. Cordelia found herself studying her father's face with new eyes, wondering what secrets he might be harboring that could provoke such a reaction from someone he had never met. Edmund sat motionless, his breakfast forgotten, his usual confidence replaced by something that looked remarkably like fear. The masked observer had struck again, and this time, the Ashworth family found themselves directly in her crosshairs. The letter lay open on the Duke's desk in his private study, its cream-colored surface seeming to glow with malevolent intent in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the tall windows overlooking the manicured gardens of Ashworth House. Cordelia stood beside her father's leather chair, her emerald eyes scanning the elegant handwriting that had already memorized every curve and flourish of the mysterious correspondent's penmanship. "My dear Duke of Ashworth." The letter began in that same flowing script that had terrorized Lord Pemberton. "I trust this letter finds you and your family in excellent health and spirits. I write to you today not as an enemy, but as someone who has observed with great interest the careful balance you have maintained between your public duty and your private obligations. However, I feel compelled to inform you that certain details of your past may soon become topics of general conversation, unless proper precautions are taken." The Duke had aged a decade in the space of a single morning. His distinguished silver hair seemed duller, his broad shoulders had acquired a slight stoop, and his hands trembled almost imperceptibly as he reached for the crystal decanter of brandy that he typically reserved for evening enjoyment. "She knows about the gambling debts," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. "She knows about the mortgage on the Yorkshire estate. She knows about the loans I took from Rothschild to maintain appearances after your mother's medical expenses nearly bankrupted us." Cordelia felt her world shifting on its axis like a ship encountering unexpected turbulence in calm seas. The Ashworth family fortune, which she had always assumed to be as solid and enduring as the limestone walls of their mansion, was apparently built on foundations of sand and desperation. "How much do we owe, Father?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice when everything inside her felt as though it were crumbling. "Nearly £30,000, the Duke replied, downing his brandy in a single gulp that would have scandalized his etiquette instructors. "If word of our financial difficulties reaches the wrong ears, every creditor in London will demand immediate payment. We would be forced to sell everything. The house, the estates, your mother's jewelry collection. We would be ruined not just financially, but socially." Edmund entered the study at that moment, having finally gathered the courage to face whatever revelations awaited him. His usual confident stride had been replaced by something approaching a shuffle, and his golden hair hung limply around his face, as though even it had lost its natural buoyancy. "What exactly does this masked observer want from us?" he asked, settling into one of the leather chairs that faced their father's imposing desk. Surely she must have some purpose beyond merely terrorizing respectable families for her own amusement. The Duke handed him the letter, watching as his son's expression grew increasingly grave with each line. The afternoon sun had shifted position, casting long shadows across the Turkish carpet, and lending the room an atmosphere of gathering dusk despite the early hour. "She wants us to attend Lady Pemberton's charity ball next week," Edmund said finally, his voice filled with confusion. "But why would someone who has just threatened to expose our family secrets then encourage us to appear at the most prominent social event of the season?" Cordelia moved to the window, her silk skirts rustling softly as she gazed out at the garden where her mother had once hosted elaborate afternoon tea parties for the most influential ladies of London society. Those days seemed like a distant dream now, replaced by the harsh reality of financial ruin and social disgrace lurking just beyond their carefully maintained facade. "Perhaps," she said slowly, her mind working through the possibilities like a chess player contemplating her next move, "this masked observer wants us exactly where she can observe us. A public gathering where every gesture, every conversation, every interaction can be scrutinized and catalogued for future use." The Duke looked up at his daughter with something approaching admiration. "You may be right, my dear. But what choice do we have? If we fail to appear at such a prominent event, our absence will be noted and discussed. People will begin to ask questions about why the Duke of Ashworth and his family have suddenly withdrawn from society." Before any of them could respond, Henderson appeared in the doorway with his characteristic silent efficiency. "Your Grace, Lord Sebastian Blackwood has called and requests an audience. Shall I show him to the drawing room?" The name sent a ripple of unexpected emotion through Cordelia's carefully composed exterior. Lord Sebastian Blackwood, the youngest son of the Marquis of Ravenshollow, had recently returned from 3 years of diplomatic service in Vienna, and his homecoming had been the subject of considerable discussion among the unmarried ladies of London society. At 28, Sebastian possessed the kind of dark, brooding handsomeness that made mothers worry about their daughters' virtue, and made those same daughters compose passionate poetry in the privacy of their bedchambers. His black hair was always perfectly styled, but somehow managed to suggest a barely contained wildness. His gray eyes held depths that hinted at experiences far beyond the typical aristocratic pursuits, and his tall, lean frame moved with the kind of controlled grace that suggested both physical capability and intellectual precision. "Show him in, Henderson," the Duke said, quickly folding the threatening letter and securing it in a locked drawer of his desk. "And please ask cook to prepare tea service for 4. As Henderson withdrew to fulfill his instructions, Cordelia found herself smoothing her morning dress and checking her appearance in the ornate mirror that hung above the fireplace. She had met Sebastian Blackwood only briefly at a reception honoring his return from Vienna, but something about their brief conversation had lingered in her memory like the haunting melody of a half-remembered song. Sebastian entered the study with the kind of confident stride that suggested he was equally comfortable in drawing rooms and battlefields. He was dressed in impeccably tailored morning clothes, a dark blue coat that emphasized his broad shoulders, perfectly fitted breeches, and boots polished to a mirror shine. But what struck Cordelia most forcefully was the intelligence in his gray eyes, a sharpness that seemed to take in every detail of his surroundings and file it away for future consideration. "Your Grace," Sebastian said, executing a perfect bow toward the Duke before turning to acknowledge his children. "Miss Ashworth, Mr. Ashworth. I hope I am not intruding upon family business." "Not at all, Lord Blackwood," the Duke replied, though Cordelia noticed the slight tension in his voice. "Please take a seat. To what do we owe the pleasure of your visit?" Sebastian settled into the chair beside Edmund with the kind of easy elegance that suggested he was equally at home in palace ballrooms and diplomatic councils. "I come with information that may be of considerable interest to your family, though I confess the nature of that information is somewhat delicate." The Duke's complexion immediately took on that same greenish hue that had appeared when he first read the morning's threatening correspondence. "What sort of information, Lord Blackwood?" Sebastian's gray eyes moved from the Duke to Cordelia, and she felt as though he were somehow looking directly into her soul. During my time in Vienna, I had occasion to work closely with various intelligence networks that monitor threats to British interests both abroad and at home. Upon my return to London, I was approached by certain individuals who are concerned about a particular threat to the stability of our social order. Edmund leaned forward in his chair, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by intense concentration. What sort of threat could possibly concern intelligence networks? Surely the problems of London society are hardly matters of national security. Sebastian's expression grew grave as he continued. There is someone operating within our social circles who possesses an extraordinary ability to gather sensitive information about prominent families. This person has been systematically documenting secrets, financial difficulties, personal indiscretions, and family scandals with the kind of precision typically associated with professional espionage. Cordelia felt her pulse quicken as the implications of Sebastian's words became clear. You are speaking of the masked observer. Sebastian's eyes sharpened with interest as he looked at her. You know of this person? The Duke shifted uncomfortably in his chair before answering. We received a letter this morning. It appears that our family has attracted this individual's attention. Then you understand the gravity of the situation, Sebastian replied, his voice taking on a tone of urgent concern. This person is not merely a gossip or social gadfly. The level of detailed intelligence she possesses suggests access to private correspondence, household staff, financial records, and personal conversations that should be absolutely secure. Henderson appeared with the tea service, arranging the elaborate silver set with the kind of practiced efficiency that allowed him to remain virtually invisible while still being attentive to every need. The delicate china clinked softly as Cordelia began the ritual of serving tea, grateful for the familiar domestic routine that provided a momentary anchor in the storm of revelations swirling around them. What do these intelligence networks believe this person wants? Cordelia asked as she handed Sebastian a cup of perfectly brewed Earl Grey. Surely mere social disruption cannot be the ultimate goal of someone with such sophisticated capabilities. Sebastian accepted the tea with a slight smile that transformed his entire face from brooding to almost boyish. That is precisely the question that has everyone concerned. Someone with this level of access to sensitive information could potentially cause far more damage than mere social embarrassment. They could destabilize political alliances, disrupt important business relationships, or even compromise matters of national security. The afternoon sun continued its steady progression across the sky, casting the study in deeper shadows that seemed to emphasize the gravity of their conversation. Cordelia found herself studying Sebastian's profile as he spoke, noting the way his dark hair caught the light, and the manner in which his gray eyes seemed to reflect the changing illumination like still water. Has anyone attempted to discover the identity of this masked observer? Edmund asked, setting down his teacup with a slight clink that seemed unusually loud in the hushed atmosphere of the room. Several attempts have been made, Sebastian replied, but this person has proven remarkably elusive. The letters are delivered through a network of intermediaries that makes tracing them back to their source virtually impossible. The paper and ink are of common enough quality that they provide no useful clues. Even the handwriting, while clearly feminine and educated, has been analyzed by experts who can find no distinctive characteristics that might identify the writer. Cordelia felt a strange sensation, as though pieces of a complex puzzle were floating through her mind without quite connecting into a coherent picture. There was something about the precision with which the masked observer operated, the surgical accuracy of her intelligence gathering, that spoke to a mind of extraordinary capability and perhaps dangerous intent. Lord Blackwood, she said slowly, what would you recommend that families like ours do to protect ourselves from this threat? Sebastian's gray eyes met hers across the tea service, and for a moment the rest of the room seemed to fade into irrelevance. I would recommend extreme caution in all social interactions, careful screening of household staff, and perhaps most importantly, absolute discretion regarding any sensitive family matters. The Duke set down his teacup with a slight tremor that betrayed his underlying anxiety. "And what of Lady Pemberton's charity ball? We have received encouragement to attend." Sebastian's expression grew thoughtful as he considered the implications. "Interesting. The masked observer wants her targets to gather in a public setting where she can observe them directly. That suggests a level of confidence that borders on arrogance, or perhaps..." "Perhaps what?" Cordelia asked, leaning forward slightly in her eagerness to hear his thoughts. "Perhaps she plans to reveal herself," Sebastian replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "After all, what is the point of wielding such power from the shadows if no one knows who deserves the credit for such magnificent manipulation?" As the afternoon light continued to fade, casting the study in deeper shadows, the four of them sat in contemplative silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the mysterious figure who had so suddenly disrupted their carefully ordered world. Outside, the sounds of London continued their normal rhythm, but inside Ashworth House, nothing would ever be quite the same again. The masked observer had not only threatened their secrets, she had forced them to question everything they thought they knew about the safety and security of their privileged world. The morning mist hung like gossamer veils over Hyde Park as Cordelia made her way along the tree-lined pathway that had become her sanctuary in times of emotional turbulence. It was barely past dawn, a time when London society was still lost in slumber, leaving the park to early riders, dedicated walkers, and those who sought solitude among the ancient oaks and carefully manicured flower beds. She had been unable to sleep after Sebastian Blackwood's visit the previous afternoon. His words about the masked observer had circled through her mind like carriages around Berkeley Square, each revolution bringing new questions and deeper concerns about the mysterious figure who seemed to know everyone's secrets while revealing nothing of herself. Cordelia's morning dress of deep blue silk whispered softly against her legs as she walked, her kid leather boots silent on the dampened earth. She had chosen this early hour deliberately, hoping that the peaceful solitude of the park might help clarify the tumultuous thoughts that had kept her tossing restlessly in her canopied bed. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke through her contemplation, and she looked up to see a magnificent black stallion approaching at an easy canter. The rider was unmistakably Sebastian Blackwood, though she had never seen him mounted before. He sat the powerful horse with the kind of natural grace that suggested years of serious equestrian training, his dark hair slightly tousled by the morning breeze, his gray eyes focused intently on the path ahead until they settled on her with an expression of pleased surprise. "Miss Ashworth," he said, bringing his mount to a halt and dismounting with fluid elegance. "I had not expected to encounter anyone else at such an early hour." Cordelia felt her pulse quicken as he approached, leading his horse by the reins. There was something about seeing him away from the formal constraints of drawing-room etiquette that revealed new facets of his character, a naturalness and vitality that had been somewhat hidden beneath his diplomatic polish. "I find that early morning walks help me think more clearly," she replied, grateful that her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "The park has a different character before London awakens, more honest somehow." Sebastian's gray eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her acutely aware of every detail of her appearance. "You speak as though honesty is a rare commodity in our social circles." "Is it not?" Cordelia asked, surprised by her own boldness. How many conversations in drawing rooms yesterday were entirely truthful? How many smiles concealed genuine feelings? How many courtesies masked actual opinions? A slow smile spread across Sebastian's face, transforming his typically serious expression into something approaching warmth. "You have a philosopher's mind, Miss Ashworth. It is a refreshing change from the usual social pleasantries that pass for conversation in most drawing rooms." They began walking side by side, Sebastian leading his horse with easy familiarity, while Cordelia found herself studying his profile in the soft morning light. There was something about his presence that made the park feel both more intimate and more expansive, as though the familiar pathways had suddenly revealed hidden possibilities. "May I ask you something, Lord Blackwood?" Cordelia said after they had walked in comfortable silence for several minutes. Of course. Yesterday, when you spoke about the intelligence networks and their concerns about the masked observer, you seem to possess more detailed knowledge than one might expect from a diplomatic secretary recently returned from Vienna. What is your real involvement in this investigation? Sebastian stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his gray eyes searching her face as though trying to determine how much he could safely reveal. The morning mist swirled around them, creating an atmosphere of intimacy that seemed removed from the usual constraints of social convention. You are remarkably perceptive, he said finally. The truth is that my diplomatic service in Vienna included responsibilities that extended well beyond ceremonial functions and treaty negotiations. I was tasked with monitoring threats to British interests that might originate from within our own social and political circles. Cordelia felt a thrill of understanding that was entirely inappropriate for a morning constitutional. You are a spy. I prefer the term intelligence officer, Sebastian replied with a slight smile. But yes, my primary function is to identify and neutralize threats to national security that might emerge from unexpected sources. And you believe the masked observer represents such a threat? Sebastian's expression grew grave as he considered his answer. Someone with her level of access to sensitive information could potentially cause damage far beyond social embarrassment. Political alliances, military secrets, financial intelligence, all of these could be compromised by someone operating within the highest levels of society. They resumed walking, following a path that led deeper into the park where the morning mist hung more thickly among the trees. Cordelia found herself processing this revelation while simultaneously trying to understand the strange emotions that Sebastian's confession had awakened in her. That explains your interest in our family's situation, she said thoughtfully. We are not merely potential victims, but possible sources of intelligence about the masked observer's methods and motivations. Initially, yes, Sebastian admitted. But I confess that my interest in your family's welfare has become more personal than professional. The words hung in the misty air between them like a declaration that neither had expected. Cordelia felt her cheeks warm despite the cool morning atmosphere, and she found herself searching Sebastian's face for some indication of his true feelings. Before she could respond, the sound of rapidly approaching footsteps interrupted the intimate atmosphere of their conversation. Edmund appeared through the mist, his usually perfect appearance somewhat disheveled, and his face bearing an expression of barely controlled panic. "Cordelia," he called out, his voice carrying a note of urgency that immediately put her on alert. "Thank God I found you. We have a crisis at home." Sebastian stepped protectively closer to Cordelia as Edmund approached, his hand moving instinctively to rest on her arm in a gesture that was both comforting and possessive. "What has happened?" Cordelia asked, noting that her brother's customary golden charm had been replaced by something approaching desperation. "Another letter," Edmund said, struggling to catch his breath. "But this one was not delivered to father. It was waiting on my dressing table this morning, along with evidence." Sebastian's entire demeanor shifted into something approaching military alertness. "What sort of evidence?" Edmund glanced nervously between his sister and Sebastian before reaching into his coat pocket and withdrawing a small object wrapped in silk. "A lock of hair," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Auburn hair, tied with a blue ribbon that I gave to someone as a token of my affection." Cordelia felt her stomach drop as the implications became clear. "Edmund, you have not been conducting an inappropriate relationship, have you?" Her brother's face flushed crimson as he struggled to find words that might somehow minimize the severity of his situation. "It was never meant to become serious. She is married to Lord Hastings, and we both understood that it was merely a diversion." Sebastian's gray eyes had taken on the cold intensity of someone accustomed to evaluating potential threats. "Lady Hastings is the wife of one of the most influential members of Parliament. If this relationship becomes public knowledge, it could destroy not only your reputation but potentially impact her husband's political position." "The letter demands that I attend Lady Pemberton's charity ball," Edmund continued, his voice growing increasingly strained. "It says that if I fail to appear, copies of certain correspondence will be delivered to Lord Hastings before the evening is over." Cordelia found herself thinking with the kind of clarity that often accompanied moments of crisis. This confirms our suspicions about the masked observer's motivations. She is not content merely to threaten. She wants her targets to dance to her tune, to appear at specific events where she can study them like specimens in a laboratory. Sebastian's hand tightened slightly on her arm as he processed the implications. Which means that Lady Pemberton's charity ball has become far more than a social gathering. It is a trap, carefully baited with the secrets and scandals of London's most prominent families. The morning mist continued to swirl around them, but the peaceful atmosphere of their early walk had been shattered by the harsh realities of blackmail and social destruction. Edmund looked as though he had aged several years in the space of a single night, while Cordelia found herself torn between disappointment in her brother's reckless behavior and admiration for the sophisticated methods employed by their mysterious tormentor. "What do you recommend we do?" Cordelia asked Sebastian, realizing that she was already beginning to rely on his professional expertise in ways that went well beyond appropriate social interaction. Sebastian's gray eyes met hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken despite the gravity of their situation. "We attend the ball as commanded, but we go prepared to turn the hunter into the hunted. If the masked observer wants to observe her victims up close, we shall use that opportunity to observe her as well." As they made their way back through the park toward Ashworth House, Cordelia found herself wondering whether they were walking into a trap or toward a solution. The masked observer had demonstrated her power over their family with surgical precision, but perhaps that very precision might ultimately become her downfall. The game was becoming more complex and dangerous with each passing hour, but Cordelia discovered that the prospect of matching wits with such a formidable opponent filled her with an excitement that was entirely inappropriate for a young lady of her social standing. The morning mist began to lift as the sun climbed higher in the sky, revealing the familiar landscape of London awakening to another day of carefully orchestrated social rituals. But for the Ashworth family, nothing would ever be quite the same again. The masked observer had escalated her campaign, and the stakes had just become infinitely higher. Lady Pemberton's mansion on Grosvenor Square blazed with the light of 1,000 candles as London's most elite families arrived for what promised to be the social event of the season. The charity ball, ostensibly organized to raise funds for orphan children, had taken on an atmosphere of barely concealed tension as families who had received threatening letters from the masked observer gathered under the glittering chandeliers and tried to maintain their social facades while watching every shadow for signs of their mysterious tormentor. Cordelia descended from the Ashworth carriage in a gown that had required 3 seamstresses working around the clock to complete in time for the evening. The dress was a masterpiece of ivory silk and silver thread, cut in the Empire style that emphasized her graceful figure while maintaining perfect propriety. The bodice was adorned with seed pearls that caught the light with every movement, and her auburn curls had been arranged in an elaborate style that showcased the Ashworth family diamonds. A necklace and matching earrings that had been wedding gifts to her great-grandmother from the king himself. The Duke of Ashworth offered his arm with practiced gallantry, though Cordelia could feel the tension radiating from his powerful frame despite his perfectly controlled exterior. Edmund flanked her other side, resplendent in evening dress that emphasized his golden good looks, though his blue eyes held a wariness that had not been present before his morning encounter with the masked observer's latest threat. The mansion's grand entrance hall rose 3 stories above their heads, its walls lined with portraits of Pemberton ancestors who gazed down with expressions of aristocratic disdain that seemed particularly appropriate for an evening dedicated to exposing the secrets of their descendants. A string quartet positioned on the mezzanine level provided elegant background music that helped to mask the undercurrent of nervous conversation that filled the space. Lord and Lady Pemberton stood at the head of the receiving line, their faces bearing the kind of strained smiles typically reserved for dental procedures. Lady Pemberton, normally one of the most vivacious hostesses in London society, appeared to have aged considerably since the arrival of her own threatening correspondence. Her elaborate coiffure was perfect, her emerald silk gown was stunning, but her eyes held the hollow look of someone who had not slept properly in days. "Your Grace," Lady Pemberton said as the Duke approached, her voice slightly higher than usual. "How lovely to see you and your beautiful children this evening." The exchange of pleasantries continued with mechanical precision, but Cordelia found herself studying the other guests with new eyes, searching for anyone who might be observing the proceedings with unusual interest. The ballroom beyond the entrance hall was already filled with the cream of London society: duchesses and countesses, prominent members of Parliament, wealthy merchants who had purchased their way into respectability, and young people whose primary occupation consisted of looking beautiful and marriageable. Sebastian Blackwood appeared at her elbow with the kind of silent efficiency that suggested professional training. He was magnificent in evening dress, his black coat perfectly tailored to emphasize his broad shoulders, his white waistcoat and cravat creating a striking contrast against his dark hair, and his gray eyes alert with the kind of focused intensity that made Cordelia's pulse quicken despite her efforts to maintain proper social composure. "Miss Ashworth," he said, executing a perfect bow. "You look absolutely radiant this evening." "Lord Blackwood," she replied, offering him her gloved hand and feeling a jolt of awareness as his fingers briefly touched hers. "I confess I had hoped to see you here, though I suspect your presence has more to do with professional obligations than social pleasure." Sebastian's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners as he smiled. "Perhaps my obligations and my pleasures have begun to align in ways I had not anticipated." Before Cordelia could respond to this intriguing comment, the sound of a small bell drew their attention to the center of the ballroom where Lady Pemberton had positioned herself near the elaborate fountain that served as the room's centerpiece. The fountain itself was a work of art. Carved marble figures representing the four seasons surrounded by cascading water that caught the light from the chandeliers overhead and created dancing patterns on the walls. "My dear friends," Lady Pemberton began, her voice carrying across the ballroom with surprising strength, "I want to thank you all for joining us this evening in support of our charitable endeavors. However, I must confess that recent events have made this gathering even more significant than originally intended." A hush fell over the assembled guests, as the implications of her words became clear. Cordelia felt Sebastian move slightly closer to her side, his presence both comforting and protective as they waited to hear what revelations might be forthcoming. "Many of you know that certain correspondence has been circulating among our social circle," Lady Pemberton continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Anonymous letters that have caused considerable distress to several families. Tonight, I want to address this situation directly and publicly." The ballroom had become so quiet that the sound of the fountain seemed unnaturally loud, and Cordelia could hear her own heartbeat in her ears as Lady Pemberton prepared to continue her unexpected announcement. "The person responsible for these letters has demanded that specific individuals attend this evening's event," Lady Pemberton said, her eyes moving across the crowd with laser-like intensity. "It appears that our mysterious correspondent wanted us all gathered in one place for reasons that remain unclear, but I propose that we turn her strategy against her." Edmund moved closer to Cordelia's other side, creating a protective barrier that made her feel both safer and more anxious about what might be about to unfold. Around the ballroom, she could see other families clustering together in similar defensive formations, their usual social confidence replaced by wariness and suspicion. "If this masked observer is indeed among us tonight," Lady Pemberton continued, "then she is about to discover that London society is not as helpless as she might have assumed. We may be bound by courtesy and propriety, but we are not without resources or determination when our families are threatened." As if summoned by Lady Pemberton's words, the lights in the ballroom suddenly flickered and dimmed, casting the elegant gathering into shadows that transformed familiar faces into mysterious silhouettes. The string quartet faltered for a moment before resuming their performance with slightly less confidence than before. From somewhere near the back of the ballroom came the sound of slow, deliberate applause. Every head turned toward the source of the sound, but the dimmed lighting made it impossible to identify the person responsible. The applause continued for several seconds before stopping as abruptly as it had begun. "Magnificent," said a voice that was unmistakably feminine, educated, and utterly confident. "Lady Pemberton, you have exceeded even my considerable expectations for this evening's entertainment." The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, suggesting that the speaker was moving through the crowd even as she spoke. Several guests moved nervously toward the walls of the ballroom, creating an open space in the center near the fountain where Lady Pemberton stood like a general preparing for battle. "Show yourself," demanded Lord Pemberton, his military bearing evident as he stepped protectively in front of his wife. "If you have accusations to make, have the courage to make them face to face." The mysterious laughter that followed his challenge seemed to dance around the ballroom like an echo bouncing off marble walls. "Courage, Lord Pemberton? How amusing! Coming from a man whose daughter's virtue was preserved only by my timely intervention in her correspondence with a fortune-hunting scoundrel." Cordelia felt Sebastian's hand touch her arm in a gesture of both warning and reassurance as the tension in the room escalated to an almost unbearable level. Around them, guests were beginning to whisper among themselves, trying to identify the source of the voice while maintaining their positions near the relative safety of the walls. "You speak of courage," the voice continued, now seeming to emanate from a different section of the ballroom entirely. "But how many of you have the courage to acknowledge your own deceptions? How many of you are living lives built on foundations of lies and pretense?" The Duke of Ashworth stepped forward with the kind of military bearing that had served him well during his years of service to the crown. "If you have specific accusations to make against my family or any other family present tonight, then make them openly and honestly. This theatrical display serves no purpose beyond your own entertainment." "Entertainment," the voice replied, and for the first time there was a note of genuine emotion beneath the confident facade. "My dear Duke, you mistake justice for entertainment. You mistake accountability for theatrics. You mistake the exposure of truth for mere spectacle." The lights flickered again, and when they steadied, a figure stood on the mezzanine level where the string quartet had been performing moments before. The musicians had vanished as though they had never existed, leaving only a single silhouette against the ornate balcony railing. The figure was unmistakably feminine, dressed in a gown of midnight blue silk that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Her face was concealed behind an elaborate mask of silver and black that covered everything except her mouth and chin, and her dark hair was arranged in a style that suggested both elegance and practicality. "Ladies and gentlemen," the masked observer said, her voice now carrying clearly across the silent ballroom without any apparent effort, "allow me to introduce myself properly. I am the woman who knows your secrets because I have lived among you, dined at your tables, danced in your ballrooms, and listened to your private conversations with the patience of someone who understands that truth is always more interesting than fiction." Sebastian's grip on Cordelia's arm tightened almost imperceptibly as he studied the figure on the mezzanine with professional intensity. "She is not just observing us," he whispered so quietly that only Cordelia could hear. "She is performing for us. This entire evening has been choreographed like a theatrical production." The masked observer raised her hands in a gesture that commanded attention, and received it instantly. "You want to know why I have gathered you here tonight? You want to understand my motivations? Very well. I shall give you the revelation you deserve." She began to descend the curved staircase that led from the mezzanine to the main floor of the ballroom, her midnight blue gown flowing behind her like liquid shadow. With each step, the tension in the room seemed to increase exponentially, until Cordelia felt as though the very air might shatter under the pressure of collective anticipation. "I am here tonight to expose not just your individual secrets, but the greatest secret of all," the masked observer said as she reached the bottom of the staircase, and began moving toward the center of the ballroom where Lady Pemberton still stood beside the fountain. "The secret of how easily you all abandon your principles when your comfortable lives are threatened." She stopped directly in front of Lady Pemberton, and for a moment the two women faced each other in a confrontation that seemed to embody the conflict between truth and pretense, between justice and propriety, between the exposure of secrets and the preservation of social order. "But first," the masked observer said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the ballroom, "I believe some of you deserve to know exactly who has been watching you so carefully all these months." Her hands moved to the silver clasps that secured her mask, and every person in the ballroom held their breath as she prepared to reveal the face that had remained hidden behind so many threatening letters and mysterious observations. The mask fell away, and Cordelia felt the world shift beneath her feet, as she stared into a face she recognized with a shock that left her speechless. The masked observer was Lady Charlotte Pemberton herself. The ballroom erupted in chaos as the implications of Charlotte Pemberton's revelation crashed over the assembled guests like a tide of destruction. Lady Pemberton's own daughter, the supposed victim of the masked observer's first threatening letter, stood revealed as the architect of the entire campaign of terror that had been sweeping through London society. Charlotte Pemberton, at 21, possessed a beauty that had made her one of the most sought-after young ladies of her generation. Her chestnut hair gleamed in the candlelight, her violet eyes sparkled with intelligence and determination, and her figure in the midnight blue gown suggested both innocence and sophistication. But it was the expression on her face that held the ballroom captive, a mixture of triumph, defiance, and something that looked remarkably like liberation. "Charlotte," Lady Pemberton gasped, her face draining of all color as she stared at her daughter in complete bewilderment. "What is the meaning of this? How could you possibly? How could I know everyone's secrets?" Charlotte interrupted, her voice carrying the same confident authority that had terrorized London's elite families for months. "How could I have access to private correspondence, household gossip, financial records, and intimate conversations? The answer is remarkably simple, Mother. I am invisible." The crowd pressed closer despite their shock and fear, drawn by the magnetic force of Charlotte's revelation like moths to a flame that might very well destroy them. Cordelia found herself studying the young woman's face with fascination and growing understanding, recognizing in Charlotte's expression the same sharp intelligence and strategic thinking that had made the masked observer such a formidable opponent. "You are invisible," Charlotte continued, addressing the entire ballroom with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed this moment countless times. "When you are a young, unmarried woman in a society that values beauty over brains, compliance over curiosity, and silence over truth. You are invisible when you sit quietly in drawing rooms while your elders discuss matters they believe are too complex for your delicate feminine understanding." Sebastian moved protectively closer to Cordelia as Charlotte began to pace around the fountain, her midnight blue gown creating dramatic swirls of fabric that emphasized the theatrical nature of her confession. His gray eyes never left Charlotte's face, and Cordelia could see that his professional training was cataloging every word and gesture for future analysis. "I discovered months ago that Captain Morrison was indeed a fortune hunter," Charlotte said, her violet eyes focusing on her parents with laser-like intensity. "But not because I was conducting inappropriate correspondence with him. I discovered it because I listened when you discussed his background with Father's solicitor. I discovered it because I read the financial investigations that were conducted before you gave permission for him to court me." Lord Pemberton stepped forward with the kind of military bearing that had served him well during his years of service, but his face bore an expression of complete confusion. "Charlotte, if you knew about Captain Morrison's true character, why did you not simply tell us? Why create this elaborate charade?" Charlotte's laughter filled the ballroom with a sound that was both beautiful and slightly unsettling. "Because, Father, you would never have believed me. You would have dismissed my concerns as feminine hysteria or youthful romanticism. You would have insisted that young ladies should not involve themselves in such matters and should trust their male relatives to make appropriate decisions about their futures." Edmund shifted nervously beside Cordelia as Charlotte's gaze swept across the assembled guests, seeming to pierce directly into the souls of everyone present. "So I created a persona that you would take seriously. I became the masked observer because a mysterious figure with unknown motives and unlimited access to information commands respect in ways that an unmarried daughter never could. Lady Pemberton sank into one of the ornate chairs that lined the ballroom walls, her elaborate coiffure suddenly seeming too heavy for her head. But Charlotte, the letters to other families, the threats, the blackmail. How could you justify causing such distress to people who had never harmed you? Charlotte's expression grew more serious as she addressed her mother's question. Because, Mother, every family I contacted was harboring secrets that could cause genuine harm if left unexposed. The Duke of Ashworth's financial difficulties were putting his family at risk of complete social and economic ruin. Mr. Edmund Ashworth's affair with Lady Hastings could have destroyed not only his reputation, but potentially compromised sensitive political information that her husband possessed. Cordelia felt her cheeks burn as Charlotte's violet eyes settled on her with something approaching sympathy. Miss Cordelia Ashworth's situation was perhaps the most complex of all, because she possessed all the intelligence and capability necessary to solve her family's problems, but was constrained by social expectations that prevented her from taking direct action. The Duke of Ashworth stepped forward with as much dignity as he could muster under the circumstances. And what gives you the right to make such decisions about other people's lives? What gives you the authority to determine which secrets should be exposed, and which should remain hidden? Charlotte's response came with the kind of passionate intensity that transformed her from a beautiful young woman into a force of nature. The same authority that allows you to make decisions about my life without consulting me. The same authority that permits fathers to arrange marriages for daughters without considering their wishes. The same authority that enables husbands to control their wives' property, their correspondence, and their very thoughts. The ballroom fell silent as Charlotte's words hung in the air like an indictment of everything their society represented. Several of the older ladies began fanning themselves vigorously, while the gentlemen exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to understand the true revolutionary nature of Charlotte's campaign. Sebastian's voice cut through the silence with professional precision. Miss Pemberton, your methods may have been unconventional, but your intelligence gathering was remarkably accurate. How did you manage to acquire such detailed information about so many prominent families? Charlotte turned her attention to Sebastian with obvious interest, studying his face with the same intense scrutiny she had been applying to everyone else. Lord Blackwood, your reputation as a diplomat has preceded you, though I suspect your true profession is somewhat more specialized in ceremonial functions and treaty negotiations. Sebastian's gray eyes sharpened with surprise, and something that might have been admiration. You have been investigating me as well. Naturally, Charlotte replied with a slight smile. A man with your background suddenly taking interest in the social problems of London's elite families suggested motivations beyond mere curiosity. I believe the term you prefer is intelligence officer. Cordelia felt a mixture of pride and apprehension as she watched the verbal duel between Charlotte and Sebastian. There was something magnificent about Charlotte's complete fearlessness in the face of social destruction, but there was also something terrifying about the calculated precision with which she had manipulated so many lives. To answer your question, Charlotte continued, my intelligence gathering was accomplished through a combination of patient observation, strategic friendships with household staff, careful analysis of public records, and most importantly, the simple fact that people consistently underestimate the intelligence and observational capabilities of young women. Lady Pemberton struggled to her feet with obvious effort, her face bearing an expression of maternal desperation. Charlotte, surely you understand that this revelation will destroy not only your own reputation, but our entire family's position in society. How can you justify such self-destruction for the sake of exposing other people's secrets? Charlotte's violet eyes softened slightly as she looked at her mother, and for the first time that evening, she appeared to be the young woman she actually was rather than the mysterious figure she had created. Mother, what is the value of a reputation built on lies and pretense? What is the worth of a social position maintained through the concealment of truth? She moved closer to Lady Pemberton, her midnight blue gown rustling softly in the hushed ballroom. I have spent my entire life preparing to become the perfect aristocratic wife. Educated enough to be interesting at dinner parties, but not so educated as to threaten masculine authority, beautiful enough to attract advantageous suitors, but not so passionate as to suggest impropriety, intelligent enough to manage a household, but not so intelligent as to question the fundamental assumptions of our social order. The assembled guests watched in fascination as Charlotte's voice grew stronger and more determined with each word. But I refuse to spend the rest of my life pretending to be less than I am for the comfort of people who fear change more than they value truth. Edmund finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. What do you intend to do now? Surely you must have some plan beyond simply exposing your identity. Charlotte's smile returned, and with it came the confidence and authority that had made the masked observer such a formidable presence. Now, Mr. Ashworth, I intend to use the intelligence and capabilities I have demonstrated to create something entirely new. Something that allows women like myself to contribute to society in ways that extend beyond marriage and motherhood. She turned to address the entire ballroom with the kind of commanding presence typically reserved for political leaders and military commanders. Ladies and gentlemen, you have been so concerned with protecting your secrets that you have failed to recognize the most important secret of all. The secret of wasted potential, of silenced voices, of intelligence and capability constrained by artificial limitations. The candlelight flickered across Charlotte's face as she prepared to deliver what everyone sensed would be her final revelation of the evening. I am founding an academy for young women that will provide education in subjects typically reserved for men: finance, politics, law, and international affairs. An institution that will prepare women to take active roles in shaping the future of our society, rather than merely decorating its drawing rooms. The implications of Charlotte's announcement sent another wave of shocked murmurs through the assembled guests. Such an institution would represent a direct challenge to everything their society believed about the proper roles and capabilities of women. Sebastian stepped forward with obvious interest. Miss Pemberton, such an academy would require considerable financial resources and political support. How do you propose to overcome the inevitable opposition from those who prefer the current social order? Charlotte's violet eyes met his gray ones with complete confidence. Lord Blackwood, I have spent months documenting the secrets and scandals of London's most influential families. I believe you will find that many of these same families will be surprisingly supportive of my educational endeavors once they understand the alternative. The ballroom erupted once again as the full implications of Charlotte's threat became clear. She was not merely exposing secrets for the sake of truth or justice. She was using those secrets as leverage to force social change on a scale that no one had imagined possible. Cordelia found herself torn between horror and admiration as she watched Charlotte Pemberton transform from a mysterious threat into a revolutionary force that could reshape their entire world. The masked observer had been revealed, but her true campaign was just beginning. The first pale light of dawn was beginning to filter through the tall windows of the Pemberton mansion, as the last of the shocked guests finally departed into the London morning. The charity ball that had begun as an elegant social gathering had ended as something approaching a political revolution, with Charlotte Pemberton's revelations sending shockwaves through the very foundations of aristocratic society. Cordelia remained in the now empty ballroom with Sebastian, her father, and Edmund, along with Lord and Lady Pemberton and Charlotte herself. The magnificent space that had been filled with hundreds of London's most prominent citizens now felt vast and somewhat melancholy, like a theater after the final curtain call, when the magic of performance gives way to the harsh reality of empty seats and scattered programs. Charlotte had changed from her dramatic midnight blue gown into a more practical morning dress of deep green silk, but she had kept her hair in the sophisticated style she had worn during her revelation. The transformation from the mysterious masked observer back to Lady Charlotte Pemberton was complete. Yet something fundamental had changed in the way she carried herself. The deference and careful modesty that had characterized her behavior for 21 years had been replaced by a confidence and authority that made her seem older, more substantial, more formidable. The immediate question, the Duke of Ashworth said, settling into one of the ornate chairs with the weary air of a man who had aged considerably in the space of a single evening, is what happens next. Charlotte, your revelations have created a situation that extends far beyond your own family's reputation. Charlotte moved to the window where the growing daylight revealed the beginning of another ordinary London morning. Despite the extraordinary events of the previous evening, the city was awakening to its usual rhythm of carriages and pedestrians, servants beginning their daily routines, and the comfortable certainties of social order that she had just challenged in ways that no one could have anticipated. What happens next, Charlotte said without turning from the window, depends entirely on whether London society chooses to learn from this experience, or simply finds new ways to conceal the same fundamental problems. Lady Pemberton sat in exhausted silence, her elaborate evening jewelry catching the morning light as she struggled to process the reality that her own daughter had been systematically terrorizing the families she had considered her closest friends. The shock of Charlotte's revelation had been followed by a kind of numbness that seemed to protect her from the full emotional impact of what had occurred. Sebastian studied Charlotte's profile with the analytical intensity that Cordelia was beginning to recognize as characteristic of his intelligence work. Miss Pemberton, your academy proposal represents a significant challenge to establish social norms. Even with the leverage you possess through your knowledge of various family secrets, you will face considerable opposition from those who benefit from the current system. Charlotte turned from the window to face him directly, her violet eyes reflecting the growing daylight with startling clarity. Lord Blackwood, I have spent months studying the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of our social order. What I discovered is that most opposition to change comes not from strength, but from fear. People resist new ideas not because those ideas are wrong, but because they threaten comfortable assumptions about the way things have always been. Edmund shifted nervously in his chair, his golden hair disheveled from running his hands through it repeatedly during the long night. Charlotte, what you accomplished last evening was extraordinary. But surely you must realize that using blackmail to force social change is hardly a sustainable strategy. Eventually, people will find ways to resist or retaliate. A slight smile played across Charlotte's lips as she considered Edmund's objection. Mr. Ashworth, I have no intention of ruling through fear or coercion. The leverage I possess will be used only to create initial opportunities for dialogue and cooperation. Once people see the practical benefits of educating women properly, the Academy will succeed or fail based on its own merits. Cordelia found herself studying Charlotte with a mixture of admiration and concern. There was something magnificent about her complete fearlessness in challenging social conventions, but there was also something troubling about the calculated precision with which she had manipulated so many lives to achieve her goals. Charlotte, Cordelia said carefully, I understand your frustration with the limitations imposed on women in our society. But surely there must be ways to pursue educational reform without destroying the reputations and happiness of innocent families. Charlotte's violet eyes focused on Cordelia with something approaching sympathy. Miss Ashworth, no family I contacted was entirely innocent. Your father's financial difficulties were the result of years of poor decisions and prideful refusal to seek appropriate assistance. Your brother's affair was a selfish indulgence that could have caused genuine harm to Lady Hastings and her children if it had been discovered through other means. The Duke of Ashworth straightened in his chair with obvious effort. You speak as though you appointed yourself judge and jury over our private affairs. What gives you the authority to determine what is best for other people's lives? Charlotte's response came with passionate intensity that transformed her face from merely beautiful to genuinely compelling. The same authority that allows you to determine what is best for your daughter's life without consulting her wishes or capabilities. The same authority that permits society to waste the intelligence and potential of half its population because of arbitrary assumptions about gender roles. Lord Pemberton, who had remained silent through most of the morning's discussion, finally spoke with the kind of military directness that had characterized his career. Charlotte, I confess that I am struggling to understand how the daughter I raised could have developed such revolutionary ideas. Where did these convictions come from? Charlotte's expression softened slightly as she looked at her father, and for a moment she appeared younger and more vulnerable than she had since removing her mask. Father, they came from you. From watching you command respect through competence and intelligence rather than mere social position. From seeing you make decisions based on careful analysis rather than popular opinion. From understanding that true leadership requires the courage to challenge established assumptions when they no longer serve their intended purpose. The morning light continued to grow stronger, casting the ballroom in the kind of clear illumination that made the previous evening's dramatic shadows seem like memories from another world entirely. Sebastian moved to stand beside Cordelia, his presence both comforting and somehow protective as they all struggled to understand the implications of Charlotte's revolution. Miss Pemberton, Sebastian said thoughtfully, assuming you are successful in establishing your academy, what safeguards will you implement to ensure that the education you provide is used responsibly? How will you prevent your graduates from using their enhanced capabilities in ways that might prove destructive to social stability? Charlotte's laugh was both musical and slightly challenging. Lord Blackwood, that question reveals the fundamental flaw in your thinking. You assume that social stability is inherently valuable, regardless of whether that stability is based on justice or merely on the successful suppression of necessary change. She moved closer to the group, her green silk skirts rustling softly in the quiet ballroom. My academy will teach women to think critically, to analyze information objectively, and to make decisions based on evidence rather than emotion or tradition. If such education proves destructive to our current social order, then perhaps that order deserves to be destroyed. Lady Pemberton finally found her voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. Charlotte, what you are proposing could change everything. Are you prepared to accept responsibility for the consequences of such sweeping social transformation? Charlotte's violet eyes met her mother's with complete certainty. Mother, I am prepared to accept responsibility for creating a world where women like Cordelia Ashworth are not constrained by artificial limitations on their intelligence and capabilities. I am prepared to accept responsibility for establishing institutions that value substance over appearance, merit over social position, and truth over comfortable deception. Cordelia felt a strange mixture of excitement and apprehension as she considered the possibility of a world where women could pursue education and careers beyond the traditional roles of wife and mother. There was something thrilling about Charlotte's vision, but also something terrifying about the social upheaval that such changes might require. What would you need from us? Cordelia asked, surprising herself with the question. If we were to support your academy, what sort of assistance would be most valuable? Charlotte's face lit up with genuine pleasure as she realized that she had found at least one potential ally among her former victims. Miss Ashworth, I would need families willing to send their daughters to be educated alongside young women from different social backgrounds. I would need financial support from those who have benefited from the current system, but recognize the need for reform. Most importantly, I would need advocates who can help convince others that educating women properly will strengthen rather than threaten the foundations of civilized society. Sebastian exchanged a meaningful glance with Cordelia before addressing Charlotte directly. Miss Pemberton, I believe there may be government officials who would be interested in your proposal. Properly educated women could contribute significantly to diplomatic and intelligence work, particularly in situations where male operatives might be too conspicuous or culturally inappropriate. The possibility of official support for Charlotte's Revolutionary Academy added another layer of complexity to an already unprecedented situation. Cordelia found herself imagining a future where women like herself could contribute to their society in ways that extended far beyond the drawing room and the nursery. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, transforming the ballroom from a space of shadows and secrets into a bright arena of possibility, the small group continued their discussion of how to transform Charlotte's vision into reality. The masked observer had been revealed, but her true work was just beginning. The charity ball had ended, but the revolution it had sparked was destined to continue for generations to come. London society would never be quite the same again. And perhaps, Cordelia thought as she watched Charlotte's determined face in the growing daylight, that was exactly what the world needed. Outside the mansion windows, the city continued its eternal rhythm, unaware that the foundations of its social order had shifted during the night. But inside the ballroom where secrets had been exposed and assumptions challenged, a new chapter in the story of what women might accomplish was beginning to unfold. The dawn of new possibilities had arrived, and there would be no turning back. 6 months after the revelation that shook London society to its core, the Pemberton Academy for Young Ladies had opened its doors in a magnificent Georgian mansion in Bloomsbury, far enough from Mayfair to maintain respectability, but close enough to attract students from the finest families in England. The building had been purchased with funds provided by an anonymous benefactor. Though everyone suspected the Duke of Ashworth's gambling debts had been mysteriously resolved around the same time the Academy was established. Cordelia Ashworth stood in the Academy's library, surrounded by volumes on mathematics, natural philosophy, political economy, and international law, subjects that had been entirely forbidden to young ladies just months before. She wore a practical morning dress of deep blue wool, her auburn hair arranged in a simpler style that suggested both intelligence and accessibility. At 23, she had become the Academy's first graduate instructor, teaching courses in financial management and estate administration to daughters of the aristocracy, who had never been permitted to understand the economic foundations of their comfortable lives. Through the tall windows, she could see Charlotte Pemberton in the garden, leading a discussion with a group of 15-year-old students about the political implications of the recent grain imports from America. Charlotte had transformed from the mysterious masked observer into something even more remarkable. A legitimate educator whose unconventional methods were producing young women of unprecedented capability and confidence. The Academy had faced considerable opposition in its early months, but Sebastian Blackwood's discreet support within government circles had provided protection from the most serious attempts at interference. His intelligence work had expanded to include monitoring international educational developments, and his reports on the political benefits of properly educated women had gained considerable attention among progressive members of Parliament. "Miss Ashworth," said a familiar voice from the library doorway. Cordelia turned to see Lady Catherine Pemberton, Charlotte's youngest sister, approaching with an armload of books and an expression of determined concentration. At 16, Catherine possessed her sister's violet eyes and analytical mind, but without Charlotte's revolutionary fervor. She had become one of the Academy's most dedicated students, pursuing studies in natural philosophy that would have been considered impossible for a young lady just 1 year before. "How are your experiments progressing, Catherine?" Cordelia asked, noting the slight scorch marks on the young woman's sleeves that suggested her afternoon laboratory work had been particularly eventful. "Quite well, actually," Catherine replied with obvious satisfaction. "Professor Harrison believes my analysis of atmospheric pressure variations could contribute to improved weather prediction methods. He has suggested that I might correspond with scientists at Edinburgh University about my findings." The casual mention of a 16-year-old aristocratic daughter corresponding with university professors about scientific research would have caused mass hysteria in London drawing rooms just months earlier. But the Academy had somehow managed to normalize such revolutionary concepts through the simple expedient of producing consistently excellent results. Edmund Ashworth appeared in the library entrance, his golden hair slightly windblown from his morning ride, and his blue eyes bright with the kind of enthusiasm that had once been reserved for more frivolous pursuits. He had become one of the Academy's most unexpected supporters, using his social connections to encourage other prominent families to send their daughters for education rather than merely preparation for marriage. "Cordelia," he said, approaching with obvious excitement, "you will never guess what has happened. Lord Wellington himself has written to Charlotte requesting information about the Academy's curriculum." It seems that reports of our educational methods have reached the highest levels of government and military leadership. Cordelia felt a surge of pride as she contemplated how far they had all traveled from that morning when the first threatening letter had arrived at Ashworth House. The masked observer's campaign of exposure had evolved into something none of them could have anticipated. A genuine transformation of educational possibilities for women throughout England. Sebastian Blackwood entered the library with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested important news. His gray eyes found Cordelia immediately, and the smile that transformed his typically serious expression made her pulse quicken despite the months they had been working together. Their relationship had developed from professional cooperation into something deeper and more personal, though they had been careful to maintain appropriate boundaries within the academy environment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sebastian announced, "I bring news that will interest you all considerably. The Prince Regent has expressed his intention to visit the Academy next month to observe our educational methods personally. It appears that reports of young Lady Catherine's scientific work have reached the royal household through Professor Harrison's connections. The implications of royal attention were staggering. Official recognition from the Prince Regent would legitimize the Academy in ways that no amount of private support could achieve, opening doors for expansion and ensuring protection from future opposition." Charlotte appeared in the library doorway as if summoned by the magnitude of Sebastian's announcement. Her violet eyes sparkled with satisfaction as she absorbed the news, but her expression remained characteristically determined rather than triumphant. "Excellent," she said simply. "When the Prince Regent visits, he will see young women engaged in serious intellectual work rather than decorative accomplishments. He will observe students who are prepared to contribute to society in meaningful ways rather than merely ornament it." Lady Pemberton followed her daughter into the library, her face bearing an expression of maternal pride mixed with continuing bewilderment at the extraordinary turn her family's life had taken. She had gradually adjusted to Charlotte's revolutionary activities, particularly after witnessing the obvious benefits that academy education was providing to Catherine and other young relatives. "Charlotte," Lady Pemberton said carefully, "I confess that I still struggle to understand how you develop such comprehensive plans for social reform. The academy's curriculum, the financial arrangements, the political connections. Such complex undertakings require years of preparation." Charlotte's smile held the same mysterious quality that had characterized the masked observer, though now it suggested satisfaction rather than threat. "Mother, I have been preparing for this work my entire life. Every drawing room conversation I was forced to listen to in silence taught me about the limitations of conventional thinking. Every social restriction I encountered showed me the necessity of creating alternatives. Every secret I discovered revealed the fragility of our supposedly stable social order." She moved to the window where Catherine's students were still engaged in their political discussion, their young faces animated with the kind of intellectual excitement that had once been considered inappropriate for ladies. The masked observer was never meant to be a permanent identity. She was simply a necessary tool for creating the conditions that would allow more direct and constructive action. The Duke of Ashworth appeared in the library entrance, his presence commanding immediate attention despite his more relaxed demeanor. The mysterious resolution of his financial difficulties had restored his natural confidence, and his support for the academy had helped convince other aristocratic families that educational reform was compatible with traditional values. "My dear friends," the Duke announced, "I bring additional news that may interest you. The Academy has received its first international inquiry. The French ambassador's wife has written requesting information about our curriculum for her own daughters. It appears that our reputation is beginning to extend beyond English borders." Cordelia exchanged a meaningful glance with Charlotte, as they both recognized the profound implications of international attention. What had begun as a desperate attempt to escape social constraints in London was evolving into something that could influence educational policy throughout Europe. As the afternoon sun streamed through the library windows, illuminating shelves filled with books that represented unprecedented educational opportunities for young women, The small group gathered to discuss plans for expansion, royal visits, and international correspondence. The conversations that would once have focused on weather, fashion, and social gossip now centered on curriculum development, political strategy, and educational philosophy. Sebastian moved to stand beside Cordelia as the others continued their planning discussions. "Miss Ashworth," he said quietly, "I have been wondering whether you might consider accepting a more permanent position with the Academy. There are opportunities within government intelligence circles for someone with your analytical capabilities and understanding of social dynamics." Cordelia felt her heart skip as she contemplated the possibility of a career that would utilize her intelligence in ways she had never imagined possible. "Lord Blackwood, are you suggesting that the government would consider employing women in intelligence work?" "I am suggesting," Sebastian replied with that smile that made everything else seem unimportant, "that exceptional circumstances require exceptional solutions. The Academy has demonstrated that properly educated women possess capabilities that could serve national interests in ways we are only beginning to understand." As the day progressed toward evening, the library gradually emptied until only Cordelia and Charlotte remained among the books that had become symbols of revolutionary change. The two young women who had been brought together by the masked observer's threatening letters had become allies in creating something entirely new, an institution that proved women could succeed in pursuits previously reserved for men. "Cordelia," Charlotte said as they prepared to leave the library, "I want you to know that your family's response to my revelations gave me hope that change was possible without destroying everything valuable about our society. Your willingness to embrace new possibilities rather than simply defend old assumptions has been essential to everything we have accomplished." Cordelia looked around the library one final time, taking in the sight of mathematical equations written on a blackboard by 16-year-old Catherine, diplomatic correspondence addressed to 18-year-old Academy graduates, and scientific journals being studied by young women who would soon contribute original research to scholarly publications. "Charlotte," she replied, "I think the masked observer may have been the most important persona ever created in London, not because of the secrets she exposed, but because of the possibilities she revealed." As they walked through the Academy halls where the sounds of evening study sessions drifted from classrooms filled with young women engaged in serious intellectual work, both Cordelia and Charlotte understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary. The birth of a new world where gender would no longer determine the boundaries of human possibility. The masked observer had disappeared forever, but her legacy would continue for generations to come. London society had been transformed not through destruction, but through the revolutionary concept that truth and education could create opportunities previously considered impossible. Outside the Academy windows, the city settled into its evening rhythm, largely unaware that the foundations of its social order had been quietly, but permanently altered by the courage of young women who refused to accept limitations on their dreams. The age of the masked observer had ended, but the age of unlimited feminine potential had just begun.